In the years after Columbus's voyage of discovery, you had quite a few Spanish expeditions into both North and South America. I want to take a moment to talk about some of the more important ones. We talked about Christopher Columbus. Um, he made his first voyage in 1492. He made 4 voyages in total, and his goal was to reach Asia, not prove that the earth was round, not to find this new continent. Um, and he went to his grave believing that is what he had done. He believed that he had reached Asia. He never believed that he had reached North America. The next two are probably our 2 most successful conquistadors. And by the way, a conquistador is simply a Spanish conqueror. So the first one is Hernan Cortez, and he conquers the Aztec Empire in what is now the nation of Mexico. The second is Francisco Pizarro, who conquers the Incan Empire in South America. And both of these men, in their conquest, managed to secure huge amounts of gold and silver. So these 2 men are going to really encourage other conquistadors to try to do the same thing. So if you're a wannabe conquistador, you're probably looking at somebody like Cortez and thinking to yourself, I want to do the same thing that he did. I want to get rich. I want to conquer all of this gold. Well, this is essentially what these next 2 guys try to do. You have Francisco Vasquez de Coronado and Hernando de Soto. Neither of their expeditions are going to be very successful. Coronado heard rumors that there were 7 wealthy cities somewhere north of Mexico in the areas that would later become New Mexico and Arizona. He led a very large army into these areas. He found nothing. And he managed to not do anything except slaughter lots of innocent Native Americans. Hernando de Soto led an expedition into what is now Florida, and from there went into places like Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee. He became the first European to cross the Mississippi River, and he actually died during his campaign. He became ill, and his men simply threw his body in the Mississippi River because he had mistreated the Native Americans so badly. They were afraid that if they buried him, the Indians would simply dig up his body and desecrate it. And here's a map just to kind of give you an idea of where some of these people are operating. Cortez is represented by the black arrow, and he ends up here in central Mexico and captures the city of Tenochtitlan, which is the capital city of the Aztec Empire. Pizarro is not on this map. He's down in South America, but the light purple represents Coronado, and the darker purple or pink represents Hernando de Soto. And neither of them discover any gold or anything else that they consider to be worthwhile. Now, this map shows all of the territory that the Spanish eventually claim in North and South America. All of their territory is divided into 4 areas known as viceroyalties. You have the viceroyalty of New Spain, which is the most important. It's all of what is now Mexico, and even parts of what would become the United States, like Texas, New Mexico, California, so on and so forth. Um, you also have the Viceroyalty of New Granada, the Viceroyalty of New Castile, and the Viceroyalty of La Plata. Each viceroyalty was ruled by a viceroy. Now, what does viceroyalty kind of sound like? What is royalty? That's the king or queen. So the viceroy is basically a vice king. Each of these also has an audiencia, which basically makes laws for each of these areas. And each viceroyalty also has an archbishop who is in charge of the priests that are operating in each of these areas. Something important to remember: the viceroy and the audiencia are both chosen by the king. Nobody in any of these areas are voting for their leaders. So when Mexico eventually wins its independence, it's going to have a very rough time because the people of Mexico had never had experience in electing their own leaders or running their own country. There's also the adelantado, and the adelantado is simply these people who are given permission to go into a new area and conquer it. Very quickly, let's talk about the relationship between the Spanish and the Native Americans. If you haven't already begun to sense this, the Spanish were not always very nice to the Indians. Christopher Columbus was definitely a bit of a jerk to the Indians. So was Cortez. So was Pizarro. So was Coronado. Very few Spanish were ever very nice to the Indians. So this creates what is known as the Black Legend. And other European countries would actually use this to their advantage. If the English or the French ever mistreated the Native Americans, they could always point to the Black Legend of the Spanish and say, hey, at least we're not treating them that badly. When the Spanish first arrived, they set up what is known as the encomienda system. And this is a labor system in which Spanish conquistadors, in return for their service, would be given a land grant and would also receive permission to use the Indians who live on that land grant basically as slaves. So this is an early system of slavery. Now, this was later done away with because the Spanish were bad about working their Indians to death. It did not help that the Spanish brought over diseases that the Indians had no immunity to. So they got sick and died very easily. On the other hand, there was the mission and presidio system. Now, you probably remember at least hearing about missions in 7th or 8th grade, but these were basically small settlements that were set up by Spanish priests. And the purpose of these missions, this is what a typical mission would have looked like. The purpose of these missions was, one, to convert the Native Americans to Catholicism. They wanted to save their souls from the devil. Wanted to make sure that they went to heaven when they died. So they wanted to teach them how to be Catholics, get them to start going to church on a regular basis, so on and so forth. But that's not the only thing that a mission did. A mission also taught them a trade. It basically tried to turn the Indians into Spaniards. It taught them a trade such as blacksmithing or carpentry or something of that nature. and they also learned Spanish. So the purpose of the missions is to take these Native Americans and turn them into Spanish subjects. Now, that is a mission. What is a presidio? A presidio is a Spanish frontier fort. And there was always one built near a mission. So for the Native Americans who tended to be a little more friendly, the mission tended to work well. For the ones that weren't so friendly, that's what the presidio was for. Soldiers would stay at the presidio to protect the mission and to fight off hostile Indians. Now, for about 50 or 60 years, nobody really tries to compete with the Spanish in North America. Toward the middle of the toward the middle of the 1560s, you start to see a little bit of competition. First of all, there are English privateers. Now, what is a privateer? This is basically a pirate that has received permission from his government to be a pirate. So, this is going to sound a little goofy, but if I received a certificate from the president and from Congress that said you can go capture any ship that comes from France, that would make me a privateer. I'm a pirate, but I'm a pirate with permission from my government. So the English, these English privateers actually start capturing Spanish ships and taking the gold that's loaded into them. So that's one form of competition that you start to see. The French actually start exploring parts of North America. You have Jean Cartier, that should be Jacques Cartier in the 1530s, and later in the 1560s, the French actually tried to establish a fort in Florida, which had already been claimed by the Spanish. They named this Fort Caroline. Well, the Spanish sent an army into Florida. They massacred all of the French that they found at the fort, and to protect their area, they established the fort that you see here in this picture, very close to where Fort Caroline had stood. And the settlement that grew up around it, they named St. Augustine. St. Augustine still exists to this day, and it is technically the oldest town in the United States.